Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Keynote webinar titled The Rise of Intoxicating Hemp-Derived Cannabinoids. This webinar is a part of the 6th annual event in the 2023 Cannabis Sciences Virtual Event Series. I am Sydney McNeil of Lab Roots, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by Lab Roots. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to first participate by communicating with other attendees using our live chat feature during the presentation. You can find the live chat located at the left of your screen. You can also participate by submitting as many questions as you would like during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Submit. If you have any trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, click on the Help Desk button located at the top of your screen within the navigation bar or from the lobby within the event. Finally, as a reminder, this presentation is educational and offers free continuing education credits. Click on the Continuing Education Credits link located in the Abstract tab from the menu at the left of your screen and follow the process to obtain your credits. Now let's get started. I now present today's speaker, Robert T. Hoban, Corporate and M&A Attorney, Co-Chair Cannabis Industry Group, Clark Hill. For a complete biography on our speakers, please visit the Presenter tab from the menu on the left of your screen. Mr. Hoban, you may now begin your presentation.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Bob Hoban, and I'm here to talk to you about the rise of intoxicating hemp-derived cannabinoids, Reefer Madness 2.0, or why do the hemp and cannabis industries, why they must align. And this is an important topic, which we'll dive into the substance of it, because it is something that is in the news every single day. And unfortunately, both the hemp and the marijuana industries tend to ignore the issue, and I will dive into that over the next 45 minutes. So excited to have everyone here and excited to be here. My name is, as I mentioned, Bob or Robert Hoban. I'm the co-chair of the Clark Hill Cannabis Practice Group. I'm the member in charge of Clark Hill's Denver office. I've worked on a very large commercial cannabis network for the last 14 years, and we like to say that we sit at the center of the world's largest cannabis industry network because of all that work and our extensive client base, and by extension, the clients of our attorneys on our cannabis industry group, which are almost 100 in number. I was the former president and founder of the Hoban Law Group, which was the first cannabis law firm, which was acquired by Clark Hill in July of 2021. I'm also the president and co-founder of Gateway Proven Strategies. GPS.global is the website. It's a leading cannabis project management and build-out advisory. I'm the president and co-founder of C-Trust, ctrust.io, which is a credit rating company for the cannabis industry. By way of background, I've worked in this space for almost 14 years now, successfully sued the DEA in 2016 case to break out the CBD industry and to advance the hemp industry, and been intimately involved in language on the 2014, 2018, and subsequent regulatory and legal issues surrounding industrial hemp. I am pleased to be here to talk to you about this concept of intoxicating hemp cannabinoids or derivatives, what I like to call IHDs, intoxicating hemp derivatives. So when you look at the cannabis plant, and when I talk about the cannabis industry, I'm talking about the cannabis industry in a way where I refer to the industry as having two distinct sectors, and nowadays maybe three distinct sectors. So the cannabis industry has historically, or at least over the last 12 to 14 years, been identified as the marijuana sector, meaning high THC plants typically sold in the dispensary system. And that system has sort of transcended the United States and now is a global cannabis supply chain featuring marijuana. I use the word marijuana because of its legal connotation and legal distinction under the Controlled Substances Act. The other side of the industry, of the cannabis industry, is industrial hemp. Industrial hemp, of course, being the plant that is 0.3% or below 0.3% THC Delta 9 content under U.S. law. Other jurisdictions around the world sometimes set that Delta 9 THC threshold at 0.2%, 0.1%, 1.5%, or otherwise. But for our purposes here in the United States, hemp is below 0.3% THC, grown in a state-approved USDA hemp program that makes it lawful hemp. Marijuana, of course, but the distinction really quickly, hemp is federally legal. It was legalized first in 2014 under the Farm Bill. We'll talk about some of those tenets here in a moment. And then ultimately in 2018, it was removed from the Controlled Substances Act, including all of its salts, derivatives, compounds, isomers, and extracts. All of that was removed from the Controlled Substances Act, including Delta 9 THC, without any limitation under the 2018 Farm Bill. Then, of course, when you go across the other side of the aisle to the other side of the cannabis industry, the marijuana side of the industry, marijuana is, of course, federally illegal. It remains federally illegal. Nothing has changed in that regard, although many states have issued some form of marijuana policy reform, meaning either decriminalization or, furthermore, going towards a complete regulated commercial cannabis marketplace. So all of these things are happening. Now, again, I would argue, and the purpose of this discussion is to talk about these IHDs, or intoxicating hemp derivatives, and where they fit. And ultimately, I believe that when you talk about the cannabis industry, instead of having just two distinct sectors, the marijuana sector, number one, the hemp sector, number two, as I just described, the third sector within the cannabis industry, because it fits, is the idea of cannabinoids. And cannabinoids don't have to be intoxicating. Cannabinoids, of course, are present in the cannabis plant. There's well over 100 documented cannabinoids based on what we know today. The father of cannabinoid research, Professor Raphael Mechoulam, recently deceased out of Hebrew University in Israel, was one of the first people in the world, if not the first person in the world, to begin to identify and to separate the notion that cannabinoids in the plant are different and that they should be identified and ultimately studied for their interaction with our endocannabinoid systems in the human body and beyond. But when I talk about the rise of hemp-derived intoxicating compounds, these IHDs, it does create a scenario where the cannabis industry is divided. Recently at a hemp-specific conference, and the hemp industry is slow to embrace the rise of these industrial hemp-derived intoxicating cannabinoids, these IHDs, such as Delta 8, such as Delta 10, such as HHC, and the like. And that's an important thing to note, is that the hemp industry itself does not tend to embrace these compounds, very much like the early days of the hemp industry post 2014 Farm Bill, where the industry was on the fence, so to speak, about the propriety and proliferation of cannabidiol, CBD. And of course, that has come and gone in terms of a controversial subject matter. And CBD nowadays tends to look like the calm and generally accepted version of cannabinoids derived from the hemp plant, whereas these intoxicating compounds tend to draw much more controversy. So suffice to say that the hemp industry does not necessarily embrace these IHDs either. Now, if you look at the marijuana side of the industry, the treatment is similar. The marijuana industry tends to look at anything intoxicating that comes from the cannabis plant, and it feels as if those compounds, the sale of those derivatives, belong to the marijuana sector, which of course in the United States is a closed loop sector, only regulated state by state in a variety of states, not in every single state, for commercial purposes, with very strict compliance and taxation rules. So ultimately, both of these sectors tend to look at this third sector of cannabinoids, or IHDs, with some sort of concern and confusion. The hemp industry believes that it tends to muddy the message as it relates to what the hemp plant can do for society, for the world, from an environmental, from a textile, from a product development and consumer standpoint. And then the marijuana sector tends to look at these compounds and says that they compete with the compounds that they sell, that they're not necessarily organic, which isn't always true, but it is a basis in truth, and that those compounds should not be able to compete with the so-called dispensary system in the marijuana sector. So we very much do have a commercial impact and a treatment. But here's the difference. While the marijuana industry is at its lowest point economically since legalization and regulation began to sweep across the states in the early to 2005 to 2009 timeframe, and then the hemp sector tends to look at it and say that it's relatively new as it treats intoxicating compounds or human consumables derived off of the cannabis plant. And the hemp industry is not at its highest point either, considering there's still no FDA regulation concerning CBD and other of the non-intoxicating compounds of the plant. Yet there's still proliferation of these compounds in the marketplace, and states have filled the void in the absence of the FDA. But both of these sides of the industry, hemp and marijuana, tend to be down economically. They've seen better times. Sales are down, numbers are down. The market tends to be saturated with ingredients and compounds. But the IHD sector seems to be at an all-time high. And dare I say that IHDs fill this void, which is increasingly being referred to colloquially as red state weed. What do I mean by that? I mean, in states where there is a licensed, regulated marijuana marketplace, then ultimately you do have these compounds competing, at least these IHDs, competing with other intoxicating compounds sold derived from the marijuana plant or included in marijuana flowers that are sold effectively over the counter in these commercial regulated marketplaces. And it has created a scenario where the sales are off the charts to the tune of billions and billions of dollars. In states where you have this competition in these places, you will ultimately note that it is competing between the marijuana and the hemp sector for these sales of cannabinoids, which tend to take place, these IHDs, in head shops, in grocery stores, in gas stations, and the like. Whereas the marijuana sector, in that competition there, believes that these consumers are drawing from the same pool and that something would need to change there. Whereas when you look at states that don't have a marijuana commercial regulated program, such as many of these happen to be red states or politically conservative states, they tend to not have commercial regulated marijuana programs. And accordingly, they have a situation where these compounds are sold without competition with or from the marijuana sector. So this frames the scenario, frames the discussion as to what's happening. And we have to look at the federal legality of these IHDs, of this red state weed concept. Marijuana is illegal at the federal level, but hemp is not. So ultimately, you have this weird scenario where the marijuana sector is telling the hemp derivative sector, the IHD sector, that it should not be allowed to exist because it's not yet affirmatively regulated, although that's changing rapidly with state regulation. Whereas the marijuana plant is unequivocally federally illegal, and there are no federal regulations applicable or germane to the plant. Those have had taken effect at the state level. The 2014 Farm Bill, for the first time in U.S. history, legalized hemp. It created an exception to the Controlled Substances Act for all derivatives from hemp for research and development of a market purposes. In 2018, that limitation on research and development was removed. Marijuana remains a Schedule I substance, whereas hemp and all of its derivatives are no longer bound or controlled under Schedule I. And furthermore, you had a Ninth Circuit federal court decision in recent months, maybe within the recent years, perhaps the appropriate way to discuss it, where in this AK Futures versus Boyd Street distribution case, the federal court weighed in the context of a trademark case, and it did determine that extracts from the industrial hemp plant, including things such as Delta 8, which does produce an intoxicating effect, quote unquote, fits comfortably within the 2018 Farm Bill definition. In other words, the federal court, the highest court in the land to weigh in on this particular analysis and this issue, has conclusively determined for the time being that these derivatives do fall under the federal definition and are therefore legal. So because of this legality at the federal level, you've seen states scramble to address the issue from a legislative framework. We've seen several states over the last 2 years take actions to affirmatively regulate the production and distribution of these types of products and compounds from the hemp plant. And you've also seen a proliferation this year in 2023 through the state legislative cycle with a number of bills looking to regulate IHDs, or Delta 8 is another way to put it. Almost always these conversations start with, well, let's ban these IHDs, and then quickly moves away from the ban concept to a concept of let's regulate it so that we don't continue to have these products in the marketplace, which are potentially unsafe and not friendly from a consumer perspective. And ultimately, that is shaping how things are evolving at this level on a day-to-day and a week-to-week basis. And I'll tell you, even the state of Kentucky, with its long history of hemp, but its perhaps disdain for its more sinister cousin, using Mitch McConnell's words, the marijuana plant, has elected to move towards hemp derivatives as its primary use of the cannabis plant. Well, that was the conventional wisdom when the Delta 8 regulatory pathway passed within the last couple of weeks unanimously through the Kentucky legislature. And within a week of that passage, a medical marijuana program also was passed in the great state of Kentucky. And it does tend to regulate these IHDs. So what are IHDs? We all know that Delta 9 THC tetrahydrocannabinol is the primary and most concentrated psychoactive compound within the cannabis plant. In marijuana with higher concentrations, it almost always produces a definitive intoxicating high when consumed or decarboxylated, depending on the form or the delivery system of the particular consumer's choice. Now, ultimately, what we're seeing with these intoxicating hemp derivatives is that while they are ultimately derived from the plant and turned into, for example, a CBD isolate, that CBD isolate is then exposed to a laboratory process, and that laboratory process begins to create these other delta compounds, Delta 8, Delta 10, and the like. So this process, while it's not necessarily understood by the population at large, has been deemed to be a safe commercial process that's regularly used in other avenues and is appropriate here. But that news of the safety has not been widespread necessarily in the production side, in the manufacturing side of this industry. Moreover, it's not necessarily understood exactly by the state governments, the state equivalents of the FDA, who are charged with regulating hemp derivatives and these compounds. So it's created a lot of confusion in the marketplace. But ultimately, if you look at the fact that hemp versus marijuana, legal versus illegal under federal law, is hinging upon that 0.3% of Delta 9 THC, it begs the question as to whether Delta 8, Delta 10, and the like fall under that calculation. And thus far, those compounds have not fallen under that computation and that methodology, because they are different compounds derived and produced in another manner. So because it's exposed to a lab process, it's led many to conclude that these products are in fact synthetic or semi-synthetic or the like. But at the end of the day, whatever the technical process that is behind the creation of these compounds, which the federal court has determined to be legal, that process is evolving and needs to be better understood by the marketplace, by consumers, and by operators and policymakers within this closed loop system. And that's ultimately what needs to happen, and is happening very quickly at the state legislators, state by state by state. Now, ultimately, the source rule meaning the rule that dictates what is legal and what's not. If I take delta-9 THC out of a marijuana plant, that delta-9 THC is illegal because it's a federally illegal compound, meaning marijuana. Marijuana spelled with an H of all things under our Controlled Substances Act. However, if I derive that delta-9 THC from an industrial hemp plant, that delta-9 THC is not a controlled substance. It's not controlled by the Controlled Substances Act, and it is otherwise deemed legal. So that is the source rule in a nutshell. The source of the compound dictates its legality unless it's specifically addressed elsewhere. And tetrahydrocannabinols, THC, is in fact a definition under the Controlled Substances Act at the federal level, but it has been interpreted to mean synthetic THC only, and ultimately a decision has not been made, and nor is there a court proceeding to specifically handle whether that definition of THC under the Controlled Substances Act applies towards these compounds. Now, furthermore, we've seen this notion that if the cannabinoid that's resulting from this chemical or this laboratory process, deriving something from the isolated form of CBD, if that compound that's resulting does not already exist in nature, in other words, if it's not already identified as a phytocannabinoid, where the DEA and the federal government have come out and said that those compounds are indeed analogs, and would be controlled under the Analog Act. There's some nuance to all of that, but those are some of the, at least policy positions that these agencies have taken as it relates to this topic over time. So as we look at what federal agencies are in charge here, it's indeed an unregulated industry when we talk about IHDs, but they're engaged in legal commercial activities. And that's ultimately the rub here, is the FDA was given not just authority, but the language of the 2018 Farm Bill and the 2014 Farm Bill expressly deferred to the authority under the FDA. The FDA's authority includes the ability to regulate compounds and anything that goes into our food, supplement, medicinal, cosmetic, pet food supply chain. There's a wide variety of compounds and consumables that fall under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has not been specifically amended to allow for hemp derivatives and hemp compounds under the Farm Bill to be regulated. But there's a vast difference between regulation and legality. Legality meaning, does a statute or a law authorize the legality of a particular plant, substance, or compound? In this case, yes. But do the regulations provide for specific processes and standards that flow from that legal plant, compound, or derivative? In this case, the FDA has not acted, even though its two prior commissioners, Commissioner Hahn and Interim Commissioner Gottlieb prior to Hahn, have both indicated that there will be a pathway for these compounds that will continue to exist in the marketplace, and that it effectively would be silly to try to put the quote-unquote toothpaste back in the tube. Yet under current FDA commission leadership, we have not seen movement towards creating a regulated pathway. Now, this is 2023, so the Farm Bill itself needs to be renewed. A variety of policy matters and agricultural-related marketplace and legislative matters will be addressed in the 2023 Farm Bill, but it has not been enacted yet. Every 5 years, the Farm Bill comes around, and when we look at this Farm Bill being enacted, we're looking at some rumblings that they're going to change the THC percentage, or that they're going to address IHDs specifically in the Farm Bill. And while my team is involved in those discussions, Only time will tell because it is early in the stages of what the FDA is going to recommend, and what the politicians on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. will do with these issues as it relates to the industrial hemp plant. So in the absence of FDA-specific leadership, states have filled the void. One of the first states, proud to say, that did regulate derivatives from the hemp plant was Colorado. We first had gotten the Colorado CDPHE, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, which is the state FDA equivalent, to regulate non-intoxicating compounds through a hemp foods policy, meaning it was a policy that was ultimately adopted. And that policy was adopted to suggest that compounds such as CBD that come from a lawful hemp plant needed to be regulated like any other food ingredients under a wholesale food manufacturing license, with various standards for consumer protection and safety and quality assurances in place. Well, ultimately, the problem with that is that the FDA has not stepped up, and other states have been slow to come around. So you only have a couple of handfuls of states that have begun to address this issue. And ultimately, if it's not specific under the FDA, does that constitute an adulterated food item? That remains to be seen, although the adulteration standards under the FDA are quite broad and really apply to anything that could be deemed a controlled substance, whether or not it's truly an adulterated compound, or things that don't have a history of regulation by the FDA. Then, of course, you look at the DEA in terms of another three-letter agency, the Drug Enforcement Agency, when it talks about THCO. THCO is a compound that's also produced in a similar process, but THCO is not in and of itself a phytocannabinoid, or does it mimic a phytocannabinoid? So it has been deemed an analog, in other words, a synthetic compound that is treated as a controlled substance, even though it does tend to or purport to come from an industrial hemp plant. It's not always the case because various chemicals and compounds are combined to produce THCO in most contexts. So the DEA has come out and said THCO is an analog, a synthetic that should not be allowed or is not authorized under federal law. But it has not said the same thing as it relates to Delta 8, Delta 10, and the like. So is it a controlled substance analog? Well, if you look specifically at the Analog Act under federal law, there's a number of things that need to be enacted there for purposes of that analysis. And that analysis has not yet been done, certainly through a court or the like. So when you look at these things happening in real time, it has prompted a number of states to respond, as I alluded to earlier, with different models. In California, you have what's known as AB 45, which is intended to regulate all hemp products and provide taxation over said products as if they are marijuana products. In other words, AB 45 prohibits these products to be sold in a widespread manner and looks to have these products run through a marijuana regulatory system. The Minnesota model, which does not have an adult use marijuana program, tends to regulate intoxicating hemp products like alcohol. It limits the milligram totals in each of these finished products. The Colorado model, with a marijuana commercial program in place, has effectively said that they've banned the sale of such products through a policy measure. This is not the law in Colorado, but this is mere policy. The CDPHE has said that these intoxicating hemp derivatives, these IHDs, do not fall under its hemp foods policy or the subsequent hemp foods law that was adopted by the Colorado General Assembly to ban these products for sale. But that only came out through a policy position. And ultimately, anyone that seeks to produce in Colorado these products for retail sale will have a challenge because they'll likely see some sort of enforcement. Whether that enforcement from the regulatory agency will stick or not is something that remains to be seen, considering it is just a policy memo, and these compounds do tend to fit quite squarely into the definition of industrial hemp foods and products under the Colorado law. But that's evolving as we speak based on a task force, and you see many states adopt this model. Florida's considering it. Texas is considering it. Alabama just passed. Kentucky just passed. Maryland, Virginia, a number of other states are looking actively at this. And because of the dollars at stake, the number of jobs involved with these IHDs, and the vast infrastructure associated with these compounds, many states are loath or hesitant to ban an entire industry. Because when you ban an entire industry, you're sending, in Colorado's example only, although economic analysis has been done in multiple states, such as Virginia and Florida, in Colorado, you're looking at $800 million of annual revenue for production. This is the wholesale production infrastructure for exportation. And then once those products are exported, you have 3,700 jobs in Colorado. You have about $500 million in infrastructure associated with this production and manufacturing pipeline. It's unlikely that the Colorado governor's office or any politicians would send $1 billion of economy outside of the state because of a tiff or a dust-up that's misunderstood between the hemp and the marijuana industry. But again, that remains to be seen as well. So right now, with the ban of retail sales in the state of Colorado for these IHDs, you have this manufacturing complex, which is proposed to continue to exist under existing law, under a safe harbor provision, and we'll see ultimately how that evolves within the state of Colorado. Now, it's ultimately two sides of the same coin. As I mentioned earlier, the marijuana industry is up in arms about IHDs, but why? Well, there's legitimacy to the positions taken by both sides when we have concerns about this IHD industry. But it does not appear, with the number of jobs, the infrastructure, and the fact that red states tend to allow the importation and sale of these compounds on a widespread basis, there are some things we need to consider, and not all of those things make sense when you compare them from a public policy standpoint. But the things that do stand to reason, which frankly begs for regulation, is that the public health needs to be respected. At the end of the day, many of these IHDs are being produced in the absence of any regulation, exposed to a lab or chemical process, which ultimately needs to be done the same way in a consistent manner in a safe facility over and over again, and overseen by a state agency that's responsible for the public health and for consumer health. And ultimately, when you look at banning these products, it's the same argument that we saw with the marijuana industry for a number of years. Why would we continue to ban marijuana when its sales happen on a day-to-day basis? We might as well regulate it and tax it and create a commercial dispensation system, because it's being sold anyway, and at least those dollars can go to the public benefit for purposes of taxes and the like. But when you look at saying, well, let's ban these IHDs, you're simply going to continue the proliferation of the sale of these IHDs, but without regulation and safety. And that's ultimately the concern at this point in time. So the products as currently being unregulated, that needs to be fixed. And that's why the states are stepping up. Another legitimate argument about this that, again, begs for regulation is there's a lack of research on the health effects of these products. They haven't been in the marketplace for that long. And we've seen some adverse health effects. We've seen illnesses. Are those attributed to the compounds as a whole? Are those attributed to the fact that these compounds are ultimately not regulated? Are these things all done because of the fact that there's not enough research or understanding what these compounds can do in the marketplace? Those are ultimately questions that need to be answered by public health authorities, and it's a challenging environment. So when you look at whether and who can buy these compounds, that presents another challenge when you think about it. Underage consumers, meaning people under 21 or under 18, depending on the state's perspective, are able to get these products without an age gate or restriction in place. They can buy them online. They can have them delivered to their homes. They can go into gas stations and grocery stores and the like and purchase these items. So these are public health angles that beg for serious consideration of this IHD or cannabinoid industry, because it's not going to go away. It's only going to continue to proliferate. The IHD industry or the cannabinoid industry, in terms of revenues, tends to dwarf various segments of the marijuana and the hemp sector in multiple places across the United States and beyond. And these sales are happening across Europe, across Latin America, and the like. And most of the products are originating in the United States, but we want to make sure that we consider the public health angle as this stuff evolves. And I would argue that the public policy needs to be considered in terms of a 10-year-old dispensary system. I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'm merely observing what marketplace, what consumers want, and what our clients are doing. And ultimately, when we have a 10-year-old overtaxed and overregulated marijuana dispensary system, is it time to reconsider the types of compounds that are sold out of dispensaries, particularly when the marijuana industry and dispensary sales are experiencing financial pain that they have not seen in 12 to 14 years of commercial industry out there? We might need to look at merging the systems. We might need to look at broader sales capabilities through dispensaries as a commercial retail outlet for a variety of substances that are not just limited to strict marijuana flower and marijuana derivatives. Now, this is particularly true when you consider the financial angle of everything that's happening here. The financial angle. Commercial activities related to these products are not licensed. They're not regulated or taxed in the same way that marijuana businesses are. So, as I talked about some of the numbers on sales and infrastructure and jobs, that's the overall impact. But think about the impact for state-specific revenue. If these businesses are not licensed, are they operating by appropriate standards? If they're not regulated, same question. If they're not taxed in terms of finished goods, is the government capturing the revenue it needs to deal with potential public health issues going forward? These are all big questions to answer that, as we sit here today, are not necessarily being addressed because the marijuana industry wants to see it dead, the hemp industry wants to see it ignored, and only some state legislatures in various states are paying attention to the reality of these IHDs and the need to capture this revenue and capture a consumer marketplace. And if you had asked me 4 years ago, I would have thought that perhaps this was a mere loophole and that it would be closed. 2 years, I was warmer to the concept, but I don't believe that we would have seen such market proliferation. But as we sit here today in 2022, 2023, today, ultimately, it is a marketplace that is not going anywhere, and which does demonstrate a different type of consumer and a consumer demand for products that the market is filling. But the question is, are these products regulated yet? They're cheaper to purchase than marijuana products, and the data would suggest that the consumers that use these IHDs in states that do have a commercial marijuana system, these consumers choose not to walk into dispensaries. They're not comfortable in dispensaries, and that they'd prefer to walk into a gas station or the like. But then the flip side of that is they're buying a product that is not necessarily regulated. And sometimes, just sometimes, when we add an additional tax that's specific to a particular product or industry, it does tend to help us as society, from a public policy standpoint, understand that those tax dollars are directed towards the potential public health impact of releasing other intoxicants into the marketplace. And when the products contain no tax element and they're easier to purchase, easier to access, and less expensive, then you have a public policy conundrum that is happening around the country and around the world, which is one of the reasons we're talking about these compounds today. Now, one of the things that we saw in Colorado in its current iteration of a bill, which has yet to pass, which is being considered at the Colorado General Assembly in this session, which ends on May 1st. So we've got a short period of time to address this, and this video may be published after May 1st. So we'll see what will have happened on that particular time in the state of Colorado and some of these other states. But when you look at sending the tax revenue into the state, classifying these compounds, these IHDs, as marijuana products for taxation, but not for oversight of consumption or production, Rather, the CDPHE, the FDA equivalent, would oversee the production. The marijuana dispensary system would oversee the retail sales and realize the tax revenue from that. So you're starting to see a sort of amorphous system that's merging different concepts, which I do believe, for better or for worse, is the future of regulation of these types of substances and compounds across the United States and possibly around the world. Going back to the two sides of the same coin, this is the problem. There's a public health angle in terms of access to these compounds as well. We talked about some of the more pronounced public health issues, but when you look at the public health angle, when you think about patients, when they still lack access to therapeutic marijuana products in various places across the United States, making these compounds available does have a positive public health angle, so long as those compounds are produced safely and consistently under the purview of a regulatory agency. And last, about the financial angle, when you look at hemp farmers have been the first and the most robust and aggressive actors since the 2014 Farm Bill was passed. They started to grow lots and lots of hemp. At one point, several years ago, we had almost 500,000 acres of registered hemp. Not all of that was grown, but registered. It was indicative of a sign of how much hemp was going to be needed and used in the marketplace. Well, we saw this crash of the CBD industry. We had all of this biomass sitting around. So hemp farmers have been burned. But what we're seeing by way of the data, that 80% of that unused historical biomass from those heavy production years is being used and consumed by manufacturing sector producing IHDs. Hemp farmers need avenues to increase biomass revenues. It can't be just CBD. It can't be just fiber and grain. Farmers need to have a diversified supply chain, and we need to embrace the many uses that the hemp plant offers us, even if some of those uses are a bit controversial. The more hemp that's grown, the better off farmers will be, the better off the world will be, the better off the industry will be. Commercial activity related to these products has generated thousands of jobs and millions of dollars of tax revenue. These are facts. Bo Whitney from Whitney Economics has produced a variety of reports documenting these facts in real time. And again, I'm talking about this and these efforts as a neutral observer because these things are happening. I'm not advocating one way or the other, except that we open our eyes and recognize that these things are changing in real time around us. So then that brings us to what is the so-called logical solution? Would a logical solution include a situation where hemp and marijuana products that produce intoxicating effects, they must be commercially regulated like other intoxicating products, such as alcohol? And I'm not using this tired old analogy about alcohol sales and cannabis sales because it's not apples to apples. But ultimately, if you have intoxicating compounds that are produced from plants, shouldn't they be distributed within the same system? Well, the first thing we need legislators and regulators to align and regulate finished goods, finished products, not the natural sources of those products. It doesn't make sense to regulate the plant except to provide certain guidelines for safety and protection from the public at large. You can make alcoholic products from corn. However, corn is not treated like alcohol for purposes of the supply chain. So this needs to change because at the end of the day, cannabinoids and other products that come from the plant, other compounds, including IHDs, are merely ingredients. Let me say that again. Cannabinoids and products that come off the plant, compounds that come off the plant, are merely ingredients to be used in other sectors for other products. And that's ultimately why we need to move away from regulating the plant itself and to sort of regulating the specific uses. Secondly, intoxicating products should never be available to under 21 years of age. This is a loophole that we see exploited in the marketplace regularly. In addition to having poor safety issues associated with a lot of the production that's done in the United States of these IHDs today, there should be an age gate because intoxicating compounds should not be bought so readily online, in person, by children, and that is something that we need to consider and policymakers need to put at the forefront of this debate. Thirdly, stakeholders must emphasize research that focuses on consumer health. When I talk about consumer health, I mean health of consuming these compounds and products, but also something that minimizes safety risks and material benefits to the plant and associated with use are identified with specificity. Consumer protection must be paramount, and banning or ignoring these compounds as billions and billions of dollars of sales in the economy continue to exist across the country and around the world is a mistake, because it does not focus on consumer health, and that should be the first in all of our minds. And last, the cannabis and hemp industries must work together to overcome this stigma, to fund research, and to improve the understanding of intoxicating cannabis products. To fund this research is critically important, because the safety of these compounds, while deemed to be safe by most scientists that have looked at these compounds closely, we don't have a lengthy history of the efficacy and toxicity surrounding these compounds when produced properly, nor do we have generally accepted SOPs or standards by which these compounds should be produced. So when you put all of these things together, you understand that there is a logical solution out there. States are considering every single day, every single week, these solutions to this problem. But I would suggest very strongly, and I would encourage everyone that pays attention and participates in this webinar series to understand what's happening around them, to not judge it out of hand, and to understand that consumer behavior dictates just about everything that happens in the United States. It's why we have a legal marijuana industry. It's why we have a legal hemp-derived compounds industry. And that's ultimately why we're seeing this proliferation of IHDs across the marketplace and around the world. So with all of that said, I appreciate your time today. This was a fast and furious 45-minute overview of the rise of IHDs and the concept of red state weed. And I encourage you to take it for what it's worth and to watch public policy evolve in this manner. And please reach out if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions. And it's been my pleasure. And I appreciate the opportunity to present this topic in this discussion in this forum. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hoban, for your time today and your important research. Before we go, I would like to thank the audience for joining us today. Questions submitted today and during the on-demand period will be addressed by the speaker via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand for 2 years until April 20th, 2025. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We do encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, goodbye.